you so much for joining us today. I've got David with me, and we are going to be talking about cognitive bias and cognitive load and how that interacts with the world of digital transformation. But before we get into the questions that I've got for you today, David, would you mind giving everybody a quick introduction?
Absolutely. Thank you, Emma. My current role is Managing Director of Barker's Commercial Services. I've been a CPO and responsible for quite a number of digital transformations over a number of years. And in addition to that, because of my, I'll call it predisposed position towards thinking about people, I'm also a PhD researcher in behavioral science and applied cognitive psychology, and therefore I have I'll call it a unique stroke different lens that I apply to all things digital, as they say.
I love that you kind of threw that in, and there is that PhD that I've got. So want to draw attention to that and that unique lens that we're going to be kind of looking at digital transformation with today. So to get us started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of cognitive load and the impact that that has on new digital initiatives or solution implementations. So can you share a little bit on kind of that idea and how that impacts the world of transformation?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that people perhaps should recognize is that particularly in times of that we've been through, that is, in terms of high cognitive load. In other words, what that means is the amount of things that people have to think about, digest, consider, process, I'll call it, in brain capacity, particularly over the pandemic period, and indeed in periods of change, things that happen in people's personal lives that whether we like it or not, is part and parcel of what we think about and process in our minds. And so cognitive load sort of has effectively three lenses to it, one of which is sort of what we call the intrinsic cognitive load, which is the complexity of really new information. Germane cognitive load, which is the sort of deep processing of information and integrating it with the previous, I'll call it, learning and knowledge. And then the extraneous cognitive load, which is particularly prevalent in a time when it relates to the distractions of working memory from really processing new information or change or ways in which people then work. And I think it's something that we perhaps don't give sufficient credit to, particularly when we've got a lot of information coming in. And think of your mind as a sort of a fixed vessel that has a fixed volume of liquid that it can take. Clearly, the more you pour into that, the more that's going to pour out. In other words, the more that you then can't deal with or process. And so, therefore, one of the things that I often talk about, particularly in cognitive load, is about the ability then for people who are handling change and putting in digital applications, digital platforms, call it what you may, is about the ability to simplify complex information, find ways also of removing, I'll call it, as many distractions as possible, but recognizing that there will be some quite natural and quite recognizable distractions that we then have to understand, work with, and find ways in which we can then minimize, I'll call it, the impact of additional information that comes into our cognitive processes. And that's particularly true where we're looking at effectively putting in new and complex systems, and particularly, digital systems are no stranger to that. So it's really recognizing the fact that we have to accommodate these things, and we have to make the allowances of people putting in digital platforms, not the other way around. So it is incumbent upon those that are seeking to make that change within a business or an organization that they take due account of that.
I think it's so important that you mentioned the idea that other things outside of just what's happening at work play into this and affect the way that we absorb change or the way that we react to that.
Yeah.
I want to kind of go more in the direction of kind of changing gears a little bit to talk about cognitive bias and how that plays into digital transformation and specifically emerging technologies. Can you share your thoughts on kind of some of the research and stuff that you've done in that area?
Yes, glad to. Again, it's probably a subject I could speak about for hours, so you'll have to stop me if I get going too much. But in essence, we have, believe it or not, over 200 cognitive biases. So these are things that it sounds quite an awful term actually, but the reality is that whether we like it or not, we have probably on a scale of 1 to 5 a different position, let's call it, in terms of things that we are more predisposed to and less predisposed to in terms of the way we look at things, the way in which we see things, and interpret the world. And what we need to address is really all the things that we have in terms of our biases. And there's some that how can I put it, are more, I'll call it impactful than others. And in particular, what we talk about is the unconscious biases. So this is, the way in which we have an affinity bias. In other words, we are more attracted towards one proposition, one set or group of people's thinking than another. The whole sort of confirmation bias. I mean, a classic example is that it's what I say to my children actually, which is you've got selective hearing. In other words, they'll only hear the words "let's go on holiday and spend some money," rather than all the hassle of having to pack and we've got to get there and it's a long journey and all that sort of negative stuff gets zoned out. And actually the things that people want to hear, which is, when we're going to get there, we're going to have a good time and, there'll be lots of sunshine and it'll be a relaxing time. So those things come into play just in the same way I'll call it in a business context. I mean, particularly in terms of change, anything that we're doing organizationally, and particularly when you think about, how can I put it, a change to somebody's way of working. Again, they will perhaps want to only consider or think about the things that are positive to them. They may also want to, they may have formed negative opinions about a digital transformation. So the problem is that they will hold on to what I call the negative attributes or sentiments, however you want to phrase it, rather than thinking about the positive attributes, which is it's more efficient, it's more effective, all the information will be in one place. But they'll latch onto the things like, actually you've got to log on and you've got to do this, and you've got to process all this, and you can only do it through this form. They will latch onto the negative points of that. So bias does play a big part in what we do, and we can think about things in terms of I could pick from a whole raft of different biases and the way in which people behave. And we have a thing called IKEA effect, which is not invented here, basically. So in other words, if it hasn't been somebody else's good idea, then it's maybe not such a good idea anymore. I'm oversimplifying for effect, really, but we have all those different sort of biases, from survivorship bias to zero risk bias. Some people are very risk averse. So there's all sorts of other biases that will come into play. And I guess the job of somebody managing the change and adoption of a new digital platform has to consider very carefully what different individuals, and recognizing that we can't deal at an absolute individual level, but we have to start to make some groupings and segment this in a way that we can manage and achieve. But we do need to consider it at the individual level as to what are the biases that are at play, and how we might then seek to address them, to mitigate them, to work with them, and to I'll call it acknowledge and recognize that these are at play, and they will be something that we have to consider in thinking about the whole way in which we might put in a new system or a new platform.
one, you're not alone in your children having selective hearing. I think every parent who is joining us today recognizes that as a part of being a parent. But it is interesting to, kind of dive into how that affects change. And to your point, making sure that you understand what individual biases and how to counteract those are coming across from your team, and making sure that you're communicating effectively and often about what the process is going to look like and the benefits of the process, specifically if you're sitting in that camp where maybe we're focusing on the negative.
Absolutely. And just one thing to add there, Emma, one thing that I would say to people is some people get frustrated that they have to repeat communication, repeat information. It's a normal thing for people to have, because of this cognitive load, process information and then have to reprocess it 4 to 6 weeks later. So it's quite a normal thing. So having to repeat communication, repeat information, repeat instructions, repeat direction is quite normal. It's not because people are being mischievous, awkward, difficult. It's quite a natural process. And so in handling that change, we should recognize that is a common feature and a common factor that we should plan for and not treat as something that is, we've got a particularly difficult group of people that we're trying to communicate with or manage change with. So, it is quite a natural thing to have to recognize and plan for in an adoption of a new digital platform. So it is something that we should plan for.
So, David, what about like when I have to ask my daughter to put her shoes on 5 times? Am I allowed to get frustrated at that?
Yeah, that's a normal human condition. However, what you might want to think about then is to sort of talk about the benefits of putting your shoes on, which is your feet won't get wet. Well, by the way, there's some stones down the road, and if you actually go out without your shoes on, it'll be really painful for you. So you start to talk about the things that are positive benefits to the individual, because you can address the individual rather than anything else. Or you might look a bit strange without shoes on. People might think you haven't got very much money, or there's lots of ways in which you can address that. That's, I'll call it, contextually correct. But it's down to then the individual who's thinking about the change to consider that before that event happens, not when it's happening. Because the trick, in a sense, is to try and understand what you think the reaction might be, or how the response might be, and how best to manage that communication.
No one realized they were going to get toddler parenting advice while they joined us for the conversation today to get us a little bit on topic. I wanted to take a kind of a look at, from your perspective, what questions should we be asking or ideas should we be exploring when we think about ethics of digital transformation and implementing some of these emerging technologies?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, again, based on a recent experience, one of the things that I wanted to absolutely make sure we did was to sort of, because we put in I'll call it a WIFM factor, a what's in it for me factor for the people that were adopting the new digital platform, it was hugely important then to recognize that in order to provide something for them, which is I'll call it a reward and recognition system at short intervals. In other words, to coach people to sort of adopt, use, and fully embed and implement the system. But was also very instrumental in then thinking about the ethics of doing that, because one of the things that we wanted to do was to understand how people use the system. Had we designed it correctly? Had it got the right features? Was it intuitive? And as you well know from your own background, understanding and putting, I'll call it, markers, for want of a better word, in the system that says, this is how long somebody's dwelled on this page, this piece of activity, this is how much they've used the in-system learning and development type tool or tutorial. That was hugely important to us, to make sure then that we could effectively course correct, as I call it, my layman's language, and correct the things that weren't working as seamlessly and as frictionlessly as I would hope they should. But we had to be very upfront with people and say, look, we're going to do this, but The reason that we're doing this, in other words, being very transparent, is to make sure then that we can iron out the bugs and make it easier and better for you to use this system. But also we want to reward you for the activities that you are doing. And the only way that we can do that is by tracking your activity and what you do and what tasks you do. And so we made that very upfront disclaimer. We were very upfront with it in terms of a notification at the start of the system, very upfront in the communications in terms of saying, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're going to do it, and give some illustrations as well about the types of things that we'd already learned and listened to, and the changes that we'd made as a consequence in the user acceptance testing phase. So, promoting that whole sort of trust, being conscious of our own biases in how we designed the system to work and operate, recognizing that there had to be accountability for people like me who were leading, sponsoring it, and accountability for the team members, but also that whole sort of ability then to promote what I call an ethical culture, which is, this is why we're doing it. It's very transparent. This is what we've learned. And sometimes when you get it wrong, sometimes sticking your hand up and saying, we got that wrong, so this is what we're going to do to correct it. So I think it's hugely important that there are some real clear ethical considerations right at the beginning of the program, but also making sure that the design captures, all the privacy, security, and integrity requirements that we might have in any one particular area. Aside from the legislation, it shouldn't really be up to just pure legislation to drive the way in which we put in place the features and the procedures and policies that govern these systems. The governance is hugely important, and so I think it's very important to take people on that journey with you, but also be very open and transparent about how you've achieved that, and what is in place to, I'll call it, protect individuals as well as protect the organization.
I like that you use the phrase ethical culture, and I think that links up to a lot of the narrative that goes around about the culture of innovation, the culture of change, that kind of transparency. But I like that you're bringing in the idea of ethics, because I think that pulls a different emotional response and maybe a different thought process of how you handle those interactions and that communication when you're thinking about it from that ethics lens.
Yeah.
Well, those are the questions that I've got for you today, David. Thank you so much for sitting down and having the conversation with me. And again, offering some very valuable insights beyond the world of digital transformation for me. But I want to encourage everybody who's watching to make your way over to David's LinkedIn. If you're not following, an eye out for any other content, interviews, conversations that David is having. But thank you again so much for joining me, David, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
If you're looking for expert tips on how to get started with your transformation or looking to hone in on your approach, make sure that you subscribe to our channel to catch our weekly Digital Transformation Talk series, where we interview experts from around the world on how to make it happen.